Thanks for joining us for the Connect podcast. I'm Cole Phillips, the lead pastor of the Connection Church, and every week we're going to look into the Bible to find out how God's Word connects to our everyday lives. It's going to be life-changing. The Connect podcast is produced every week for your growth and inspiration. You can find all the show notes at makingtheconnection.org. You can also find the podcast on your favorite podcasting service. Follow me on Twitter at Cole Phillips and on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find all the links in the show notes. Now, let's get into the study.
All right, I want to welcome you to the Connect podcast. I'm excited about getting into this with you today, especially getting into God's Word, getting it into our hearts and our minds, our lives, so we can get it out of us into the world around us. And that's really what it's all about. It's about walking through the Word and living it out. And we are walking through the book of Acts. We're getting ever closer, so much closer to the end. And today, if you have your Bible, I'd encourage you, grab a Bible, grab something, take some notes with. And I am including on our app, I'm including the transcript with all the notes that you can follow along with, and even some discussion questions you can use if you want to kind of take this a little deeper with your family, with your friends, or just to consider yourself. And man, as we are looking today at the landscape of the country, of the world, and especially looking at the church, it leads us to think, what is going on in the church today? There was a new poll that was released actually by Lifeway Research that says that churchgoers believe public perception of Christians is declining, is in the tank in the United States. That means when people are looking at the church or looking at Christians, they have a worse and worse opinion of Christians. And of course, this is perception. This is what Christians are thinking. People are thinking about them. And that could include some of our own self-reflection of going, this is what I think about other Christians as well. And so 53% of Protestant churchgoers say most Americans have a positive perception of Christians. And 40% disagree with that. 8% don't really know. There was a time in our country when if you were living on a street and there were some Christians living on the street, living on your block, then you'd think, oh, those probably are pretty good people. Well, they're, good people. Today, not so much. People start looking at Christians and they think, what are they up to? I'm not sure that, that I'm trusting them. And this also says more consensus exists on the direction that public sentiment is headed, that it is getting worse. And so here's a particular kind of the numbers that you see here that say, which, if any of the following do you believe contributed to a worsening perception of Christians in the United States? Why is it getting worse? And of course, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, God is not relevant. We've kind of just tried to remove God from our culture and from the public, square and the schools, and they've tried to remove God. Okay, you can't do it. You can't do it. God is present, and there's just no way of accomplishing this. This is a futile task. So let's disregard that. Now let's look at what they actually think about Christians. Well, 45% say Christians don't act any different from people who aren't Christians. So this is an indictment of us, that the reason that perception is plummeting is because of the fact that we don't act any different than anybody else. And so obviously they're thinking, what's the purpose? What's the point? They actually want us to act different, to be different. As Jesus says, be salt and light. There's also these other ones down here. So I'm going to deal with the ones that I think are things we can do something about. Christians often treat each other poorly in person and on social media. So that's like a combined 54% right there together. The way we're treating people, the way we're attacking each other, the way that we're attacking well, really, that's what he's saying. They're saying, it's been said the Christian army is the only one that shoots its own wounded. And so we've got to work on that. These are all issues when it comes down to it of integrity. These are issues of integrity, telling the truth, keeping your word, living out what you say, what you claim you believe. And if you want to be a person of integrity, it's pretty simple. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's simple. Always tell the truth. Always keep your word, keep your promises, and do what you say you believe. Integrity means when you say something, you're telling the truth, you're telling the whole truth, you're telling nothing but the truth. And some people, that's hard. We want to embellish, we want to spin, we want to improve the story just a little bit, maybe improve the production budget a little bit. Let me just ask you personally, have you ever broken a promise? Think about these. These are some that get broken a lot. I'll get it back to you as soon as I'm done with it. I won't tell anybody what you've said to me. I'll be home at 6, dear. We can play this weekend, my son. We'll get to it when things settle down. The diet starts tomorrow. These are some lies that we tell. I'm talking integrity in the big and in the small places of life. Now, in Acts chapter 25, and we're going to deal with this whole entire chapter today, verses 1 through 27, we see Paul is now slowly but intentionally, he is making his way to Rome to face a variety of trials. And one of the things that we see in this passage is that if you really want to live, you've got to be free of the fear of dying. That's what happens when you put your faith in Jesus. All of a sudden you can really live because now you're no longer afraid. It's like, what's the worst you can do to me? Threaten me with heaven? I'm going to live for Christ. And this is all set in the year AD 60. So about 27 years after the death of Jesus and resurrection of Jesus. And so when God sets his seal and his plan on our lives, then our responsibility is to move wholeheartedly and single-mindedly toward that goal that he's placed in us. And for Paul, that meant testifying about Jesus and the good news of Jesus in Rome. And so he's facing charges here from the Jewish religious leaders. And Festus now has succeeded Felix as the Roman governor. And so Festus now immediately tries to resolve this case by hearing out Paul and the Jewish leaders who just won't give up on trying to get rid of Paul and destroy him. And so, while I'm not going to give you any more spoilers, let's get into it. The first thing we see here is live a life of integrity. We see this in Acts 25, verse 1. It says, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. And Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. So these religious leaders were trying to use every single political trick they could to get rid of Paul. And these were supposedly spiritual leaders. But we know, just by looking around, people will often do anything they can to hold on to their power, to their position, to their prestige. They'll even lie. And so we see here how consistently Paul lived with integrity, because the people who are wanting Paul out of the picture, they're looking at Paul's life and they're trying to find something, if they can find anything that he's done wrong. It reminds me of this famous statement from Lavrently Beria, who was Joseph Stalin's secret police chief. And he said, "Show me the man and I'll find you the crime." So it's supposed to work the other way around. Somebody commits a crime and you're trying to figure out who did the crime. Instead, this is a way of getting rid of your opponents by finding something that a person has done. And this is the prime example of injustice. But we see this happening even in today's political system over and over and over. And Paul, he holds on to his innocence no matter what they're throwing at him. Here's the definition of integrity. And my best definition of integrity is being the same through and through. Integrous. It means the same through and through. What's on the outside matches what's on the inside. It means that you're not hiding secret sin in your life or secret sin in your internet search history. It means that your walk matches up with your talk, and we do what we say. And in light of the recent high-profile scandals in the church in America among pastors, it's been so discouraging to me to have to go through my bookshelves and just pull so many of my books of authors who have lived double lives. They're not who they claimed that they were. Now, it's not that, the other authors on my shelf, or even including myself, that anyone is perfect. But when you are out living a duplicitous life and you're presenting yourself as one thing, but really you're living another way, it's just so discouraging. It's discouraging and harmful to the cause of Christ, to the church. And, it was just making me sad looking at these authors' names, these pastors' names day after day. So I'm taking them off my shelf. But it reminds me of James 1:8 that says, "A double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways." Life in between isn't on both sides. Living in the middle of the road means that you end up like roadkill. And so we have to live with integrity in our private life and our public life. We live with integrity at home and at work, and we are who we say we are. You don't have to claim to be perfect because you're not, and I'm not. But the way we present ourselves needs to be authentic, and we live what we believe. Let's look at how Paul handles false accusations so we know how do we respond when people accuse us with lies and with things that aren't true. So verse 6 says, "After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day, he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. They were making them up, these false charges." And this kind of thing happens all the time. People make up false charges against somebody to get them out of the way. And, Jesus said this in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5:11. He said, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." But we want to make sure that they are false charges, that we're not doing the things that they want to accuse us of, because lying is off the table for Christians. And God says, do not do it. Don't lie. Revelation 21:8 puts lying in a list of some sins, of the sins that lead to hell, which we know all sin ultimately leads that direction. But there's this list that says, but the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. And yes, if you follow Jesus, you are forgiven. He completely forgives you. But this shows how seriously God takes lying. And included in that is lying against another Christian, somebody who's serving God, but maybe because of jealousy or some other motivation in your life, you make something up about them, you say it, you post it, you accuse them. But Paul, he shows incredible strength that comes from God as he defends himself from these false accusations in verse 8. Then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? And Paul answered, I'm now standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Okay, let's talk about this. Verse 12, after Festus had conferred with his counsel, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. So Paul defends himself. He knows his legal rights, but he's trusting in God's plan and God's hand through it all. Paul shouted these words, I appeal to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, it was his right to appeal to Caesar if the charge involved a capital offense. And once you invoke those words, I appeal to Caesar, nothing could stop it. The person had to be taken to Caesar. Festus was shook. He knew he had messed up. Things had gotten out of hand. I appeal to Caesar was irrevocable. The words couldn't be taken back, and he had lost his chance to sort of appease the Jewish people. He had to send a Roman citizen to trial in Rome with these weak charges against him that his own lack of wisdom in justice now would be in question. He went and consulted his advisors. Good idea. Returned and pronounced that the request had to stand. And so we see God is at work, overruling their will and their purpose. God's purpose was going to stand. And this is going to take Paul to where he was planning to go the whole time. Now, when you are falsely accused, and when I'm falsely accused, it's very hard to respond as Paul does. What did he do? Well, we need to stay calm. We need to not get overly defensive or overly emotional. Just stick with the truth. Stick with the facts, just the facts. But whatever you do, don't waver from your convictions about Jesus and what is right and true. Don't compromise that. Nothing should keep us from staying faithful to God. 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Don't let these false charges, the fear that you're facing of what's going to happen, don't let it sway you from standing firm in the Lord. Let's look at these authorities here in verse 13. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea. By the way, Bernice was Agrippa's half-sister that he was living with. Not a good look here. Arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, there's a man here whom Felix left as prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them, It is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they have faced their accusers and have had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the men to be brought in. When his accusers got to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I'd expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. Now Festus, he was confused. He was hard-hearted when it came to spiritual things. He had been so ignorant about Jesus and the fact that Jesus raised from the dead. But now he knew. Paul shared the good news of Jesus with him. And now this is on him. He's responsible for how he responds to the truth of Jesus. But his response instead was to make fun of the reality that Jesus rose from the dead. He refused to bow the knee and to trust and surrender to Jesus. I think we should be reminded of the purpose of government, like the purpose of the police is to protect and serve the people, not the other way around. In the Roman Empire, officials and their offices existed to impose the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome. They used Roman laws, Roman roads, and Roman shipping, commerce, and trade. And what the Christians did was they utilized this system that was in place to share the gospel of Jesus all over and into the heart of the Roman Empire. And this is how God's plan prevailed. When Paul goes before Agrippa in verse 23, it says, the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So this hearing before King Agrippa is a circus. This isn't about true justice. It's all about making a scene. And all the pomp and the circumstance is not is not helpful in finding what is true and what is right. It doesn't mean that those with the riches and the fame and the glory, such as the king, have a better character or that they're right. It just makes them think that they're something when they're really not. I saw this political advertisement video, you may have seen it the other day, that featured a whole list of celebrities, including most of the Marvel superhero actors and many others. And they're talking about the next election, and they're saying, this is so important. We all had to get together to tell you what you should think and how you should vote, as if their opinions about politics or what is good or bad or right or wrong or true are more important than anyone else's. In fact, if you look at the train wrecks of their lives and what the devastation that's been left in the wake of their own lives, then we shouldn't care what these celebrities think. In fact, we probably should just hear their opinion and do the exact opposite of what they recommend. But that's true of most of the ruling class, that of the cultural elites that are so out of touch in America, and they're in it for themselves. It reminds me of what the prophet Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 5:14. It says, this is from the Living Version, that says, hell is licking its chops in anticipation of this delicious morsel, Jerusalem. Her great and small shall be swallowed up, and all her drunken throngs. That's a picture of hell just waiting to swallow up all the glitz and the glamour, the pomp and the circumstance, the depravity, of what we worship and glorify in our celebrity culture today. With all of its appeal now, it's going to end in destruction. So remember that all that celebrity and glory and fame, it will all be burned up. It will all disappear. And it does here. It disappears so quickly. Today's hero is tomorrow's zero. And they are consigned and confined to the dustbin of history to be forgotten. But people of real character and true conviction will stand the test of time. How many of you, before we started talking about Festus and Agrippa, even remembered their names? But you do remember this prisoner, Paul, who stood before them. Many more people know Paul, and he changed all of history. Verse 24 says, Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I've brought him before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it's unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. Now, big words, Festus's speech, it was formal for a formal occasion, but it was the speech of a judge who was presiding over an unjust trial, and Festus knew it. And it raises this question of how many people commit unjust acts and then continue that injustice in a formal setting before the public. How many deceptive and public shows are put on for the sake of saving their own reputations? It's so many. You know, the Jews, when they looked at King Herod Agrippa, they saw a debased man who lived an adulterous life of debauchery and depraved. He ignored God's laws. He was living, like I said, with his half-sister Bernice. So this was the whole thing, you know, is not a fair trial. But in spite of the challenges, Paul is trusting in God and his plan. And so can you. You can trust in God's plan even when the circumstances seem to be against you and it's not looking like it's going your way. God can use even the trials you're facing for a greater purpose. And we've seen over and over how Paul's innocence is confirmed as he goes through the trials with the Roman authorities, and now even a Jewish king would take this same position. So what do you do when you're unjustly accused and you're attacked and you're lied about? Hold on to your integrity. Don't compromise or stoop down and respond in a way that compromises your own convictions and what is right and true. Keep your wits about you. Don't lose it. Respond to the accusations calmly and clearly. And like Paul did, it's okay to exercise your legal rights as they apply to you, but you don't depend on the legal system. You don't depend on the politicians or the lawyers or the judges over your trust in God. Yes, you should get good counsel and wisdom when you're dealing with hard issues that are hard to understand. But as Christians, we always look to God for our support, for our strength, for our deliverance. That's where our help comes from. Politicians will usually put power over what is right and what is just and what is true. We are not trying to find security in the world. We're trying to find our security in Christ. I'm thinking of Psalm 121, such a powerful song that reminds us of this. I want to read this to you. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. It is God who is our refuge, not worldly politics. Yes, we participate in politics, and we should and we need to, perhaps now more than ever before. But understand that politicians are in it for themselves, not for you. And you know the origin of the word politics, right? Poly means many, and ticks means blood-sucking leeches. So we're talking many blood-sucking leeches. However, today still, even politicians are supposed to be following the law. So know your legal rights and leverage those, but use every opportunity you have, even as Paul did, to point people to Jesus. I want to close with this idea that, the church world is not the only area that rejects its brilliant members or leaders. See, the Jewish people were pressing for the execution of one of the greatest spiritual teachers who ever lived. They had exiled him from their city and from their religion, but that wasn't enough. They wouldn't stop until he was dead. So they didn't want to hear any more about the Messiah who had died and rose again. And they were wanting to quiet him and shut him up. Now, a more modern story, though this was several years ago, in 1968, there was a guy who earned his degree in zoology from Syracuse University. And he applied to medical schools all over America, and every single one of them rejected him. He attended the University of Bologna, but he only spent 2 years there on campus before he dropped out. Years after he graduated from Syracuse, he earned a medical degree from the University of Utah. His name was Robert Jarvik, and he used his brilliant mind to create the first permanent artificial heart and revolutionize the way the medical community dealt with heart disease. Now think about the thousands and thousands of Christians in churches who have dropped out of the church and of serving the Lord because they've been discouraged or because they've been mistreated by their Christians, many of whom have been mistreated by their leaders and by their pastors who were supposed to be taking care of them and discipling their flock. But it's not just church members, it's also thousands of pastors who've been hurt by church members and betrayed and have become disheartened and depressed and driven out of ministry and basically sent to sell real estate or used cars. We can be discouraged by these situations, and we can ask God to help us from being the ones who are discouraging people in church and in ministry. But we also have to watch our own lives and our own service. Somehow we need to learn the joy that Paul had, who, as we're going to see in this next chapter, found joy even in his chains because they gave him another opportunity to share the message of Jesus in places that he never would have been able to go as a free man. And the Holy Spirit can give us that kind of positive attitude today. But we need to be just as committed to Jesus and just as dependent on his grace as the prisoner of Festus, Paul, was back in the day. And so we need to make sure, as we think over what we've talked about today, that we're living lives of integrity, that we are responding calmly to our accusers, that we are trusting in God through the whole process. And I want to encourage you to begin to live this out in your life today and in the coming week, and know that whatever you're facing today, with the power of faith in Jesus, living a life of integrity, walking with him closely, he can lead you both through what you're facing and to the place that he has planned for you. So thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you